Welcome everyone to the Brattleboro Literary Festival. We have here with us today Susan Minot and Peter Orner. As well as being accomplished novelists and essayists, they are masters of the short story. Minot's fiction has been included in the Best American Short Stories 1984, 1985, the Penn O. Henry Prize Stories 1985, 1989, and in 2011 for her story Pole Pole. Her nonfiction and travel writing have appeared in the Best American Travel Writing 2001 and McSweeney's, New York Times, Paris Review, Vogue, and others. Her newest book is Why I Don't Write and Other Stories. Little show and tell. Peter Orner's Esther Stories won a prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Goldberg Prize for Jewish Fiction, and was a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Prize. Orner's first novel, The Second Coming of Mavala Shikongo, which is set in Namibia, where Orner worked as an English teacher in the 1990s. It won the Bard Fiction Prize and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He's a professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth. His newest book, collection of short stories, is Maggie Brown and Others. So, Susan and Peter, welcome to the Lit Fest. Just a little housekeeping here. These terrific writers will talk about their books for about a half an hour, and then they'll answer your questions, which you can post under the Q&A box on your screen. If you want them to read, you suggest that, and they will happily accommodate you. Attendees can also upvote existing questions by tagging the thumbs up icon. So welcome again, Peter and Susan.
Thanks for having us, Stephanie.
Oh,
Thanks
sure.
for the introduction.
Sure, our pleasure. We could start, if you wanted, with this wonderful, provocative paragraph from Peter's story. I'm getting to the title, Ineffectual Tribute to Len, and it's about short stories. Dear Little Brown and Company, you say stories don't sell, and God knows I have no reason to doubt you. I've seen the numbers on my story collections, and they aren't pretty. I know I'm basically a charity case, but don't you see? It's what Chekhov teaches. The last period of the last sentence of a story isn't a full stop. It's a horizon. It's not about word count or pages. That's a smothered way of thinking. We're talking about the quest for infinity here. Horizons can't ever be reached, no matter how many words you lard on a novel. The attempt at closure is inherently dishonest, but a story, one that ends but doesn't end, that's infinity, immortality right there. Okay, you two, take it away. What do you think?
Well, I'll comment on it first since Peter wrote it. So
right, yeah, good.
He kind of,
Thank you.
I'm sure you can elaborate on it because it's pretty it's pretty thought-provoking. But it made me think of, and I can't remember who was talking about, someone was talking about Chekhov and saying one of the reasons why he is such a master is besides knowing what to sort of leave out in a story and what to put in, which is so important in a short story, probably more than a novel. His stories usually, when they end, you feel like you're suspended, which is a kind of another way of saying, like, infinity is, sort of stretching out around you. But that suspension he does, it's never a kind of conclusion. It's, I've told you everything you need to know up to this point, and this is where you're going to stay kind of floating, like possibly knowing where you'll go into the future. But yeah, so that infinity is even more of an extreme version of that, like that description, I think. Yeah.
I think Susan said it perfectly, and I'll just add that the context of that quote is a guy who's avoiding writing a novel because he's under contract for it and is writing a letter in the story to his publisher, as you said. So it's it has nothing to do with the story itself. And so it's actually an example of what the writer is talking about not doing. He's larding up words that have literally nothing to do at all with his supposed tribute to his old friend. So it's a bit of a joke, but in that joke contains everything that I do believe. And just to add on to what Susan said is that, and it's not like a great novel doesn't leave you suspended, or a great poem doesn't leave you suspended, or a great article, right? I mean, short stories don't corner the market on this necessarily, but there is something, and I don't know how I could even articulate it, that draws certain people to the effect of, 15, 17, 3, 7 pages and a suspension. And I would sort of add almost like a free fall that keeps going. That's how I have always envisioned it. And I must have picked that up from Chekhov somewhere along the line. But that's how I would love to feel that a story leaves you in some kind of motion, not an answer motion.
I think also I'm teaching a short story seminar right now at Stony Brook, where I teach. So I'm very much not defending the short story, but, reminding my students of, because the short story, just by saying it's short and story, it seems to be sort of dismissive. And I am, it's actually a form that I think I feel certainly more attached to than the novel, but I do think that it's not only just as valid a form, but it has a kind of thwack that a novel doesn't have. A novel is an experience and you're with it for a while and stuff, but a story actually is more like a poem. I think when you're left in that state, whatever it is at the end, you can kind of keep it all in your head somehow, just by its very length. I like to use a quote that Borges said when he was lecturing at Harvard, doing a series of lectures, when he was actually blind. So he just lectured standing there, with no notes whatsoever, 6 lectures of an hour each, and they're just fantastic. You can see them on YouTube. But he said for him, he sometimes finds almost every time a certain weariness when he's reading a novel, and that he finds that stories, he gets just as much complexity, but in a more pleasurable way than in a long novel, which I think is, we're not trashing the novel here, but there's certain sort of extra offerings that a short story has, I think, that a novel doesn't.
And if you think about Chekhov and Borges, and I always find myself doing it too, even though I resist it, is defending the story or talking it up, or I always say in my, if you think that writing a story is a stepping stone to something grander, hang on a second, right? It is a high wire act, similar to very few things, right? Again, not comparing the two in terms of novels, poetry, short stories in terms of difficulty, but there's no training wheels for a longer piece via a short story. And the existence of having Borges and Chekhov in the universe among so many other wonderful writers, but those are two that happen not to have generally written in the longer form, although Chekhov.
That's true. That's true. But your stories, Peter, are, I'm going to admit, I haven't read the whole book, but I've looked through it. I'm most of the way through. There are not very many long, if we're talking about length, long stories here. Now, was that a choice, or did you say, okay, they're just going to be much shorter pieces, or how did that happen? How did the short become the thing that you were doing?
I don't, it's not conscious necessarily. I just don't want anything extra generally, even though I'm contradicting what I said 5 minutes ago. But I sometimes think, because I literally, not only I write by hand, which is no big deal. It's just I cannot possibly not do that. It's just what I've always done. And I think my hand starts to hurt. I mean, literally, I know this sounds ridiculous, but at a certain point, my hand starts to hurt.
No,
And
it's a good metaphor, I think.
well, I grip the pen. As a kid, I think I learned badly. You know, I grip the pen very, very hard. And I think that, I don't know if it's something about that kind of energy or whatever. I'm trying to just, I don't know. And, you know, I would like to unlearn this, frankly, you know.
But you don't have to, do you write each piece in one sitting? I mean, you can, you know, yes, you do.
Yes. I mean, I guess that's how I do it. Yeah. I
Oh,
mean, even in a longer piece, I'll try and rewrite. If I can't, I'm a little bit annoyed at myself if I have to continue.
I see. So in a longer piece, you'll write that kind of in one sitting, like you'll know how much, you know, that's the way that John Ashbery wrote his poems. He didn't do a lot of rewriting. He thought, if it's just going to be this breath I take and how long it takes to do it, I don't want to work over it too much.
I like that idea. I mean, again, it's not always the same, and I'm sure because you have some very, very tight pieces in this new book, and then ones that expand in ways. I mean, I was very intrigued by your use, especially in the last story of the well-placed space break, because some of your space breaks are just devastating, right? And I just wonder, you know, can you talk a little bit about that, like why you decide you needed a little bit extra blank space, because so much was going on, especially in that particular story.
One of the people I learned that from is, well, I think from the cinema is one place you learn the idea of a cut to another image, even if you're in the same scene, right? You know, and there's a dynamic behind that. But Raymond Carver also did in his sort of masterful story, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. It just takes place in this one sort of hour. People are sitting around talking, and every once in a while there's a space break. And you're like,
and it's not out of scene, right? I mean, he's a space break is like him controlling
so much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like it's a cue, like, okay, now we're going to Paris in 1955 or something.
Right, back. It's
still in that living room with those couples. Oh, that's such a,
yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for noticing the space breaks, Peter. I think that's probably something only another writer would notice. So
well, I have another question. This is a story called The Language of Cats and Dogs, which I can't recommend more highly. And I wonder if you could talk, there's so much I could ask you about this story as well as the first story and others. I just wonder if you could talk about time and how it worked in that particular story. So it's a story about something that happened, an incident that happened 40 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know what I'm going to do? Maybe we weren't planning on this, but I'm just going to read one paragraph from the story, because it's sometimes one I read, and it sort of talks about revisiting an experience, right? So this story is about something that's happened to the character who's reflecting on it. You know, it happened 40 years before when she was in college, right? So you think you are done with an experience once it is over and it is set into some version in a story, and there it will sit. But if you return to the experience many years later, because you are, say, urged by a movement in the culture to re-examine the treatment of women, an examination which seems to come every 50 years or so before it fades away again, then you might discover new details waiting for you unnoticed. What you do not know when you're young is that you may, as your life goes on, return to things that happened, and that the more you visit a thing, the more time you spend experiencing it in reflection, in memory. So that an event which took, say, an hour in your life may afterward be recalled and visited by you 50 times over, each time you remember it. Moments of happiness, such as the period one fell in love, may be remembered again and again, weeks worth if it was a really compelling thing to think about. And moments when one was shocked might be similarly preserved, not voluntarily, and exist as a freeze frame. So that answers some of the consideration of, you know, time and reflection. And
I wonder if this is, and again, this is not unique to short stories, but I find that queuing in after decades on in this case, a story that, you know, that can be almost encapsulated within about maybe a 10-minute period, the part that's remembered when this guy says to her, you know, let's speak in the language of cats and dogs, which is, I mean, anyway, again, I don't want to wreck the story for anybody.
It's so cruelly funny.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the thing, you know, like, and as Sophie even thinks in the story, she says, like, did he even think that would work? I mean,
Right.
what, you know, and this guy's a writer. He should,
Like
but the idea of a story looking back on a moment after decades, that seems, you know, I might say that maybe unique purview of something that might be in a smaller form. Of course, there's a million exceptions to that, but it seems to me that level of intensity to examine that.
Well, and then of course there's the moment, but it makes one, and I teach this to my students when writing a story, that you could just start off focusing on one little moment. And because we have so many layers in our relations and what's happened to us, just to unpack why that moment has these aspects to it, why it's important, will be enough for a story. You know, and that's the formula for writing a story now.
Well, in a way, I mean, and there isn't any, of course, and the minute we start saying there is, then it's a disaster, right? But
Right.
I think queuing in on moments for me is a big one, and part of the reason that this story resonated with me so much, because it sort of articulated the practice in a way that, you know, that was just so clearly said, and yet, you know, devastating too.
Well, it makes me think of your story, The Dead, which is a 6-page story. And you think the moment it's recalling is this sort of haphazard date of a man who a young man who heads off with a woman he's just met to go to a séance, like an army barracks somewhere, like hours away. And will they be back in time to go to their jobs and stuff? And you think that's what the story's about. And then at the very end, there's a moment when they almost have an accident in the car, and the narrator does something very that he's not proud of, like in response to it. And that ends up being the moment that's returned to again and again.
Another story taking place with two strangers in a car, you know, which you describe as being in a fish tank, which is just totally accurate. It is. You're in that, you know, with the doors, with the windows up. Oh, maybe in honor, you know, just following your lead, I'll read a tiny bit of that story, which does sort of encapsulate these ideas in a way that, yeah. When something happens, for better or for worse, it's happened. It has a before and an after. Maybe you can talk about it, maybe you can't. But what about something that almost happens? What almost happens repeats itself. I've come to believe this as a kind of personal gospel. We're stopped in the opposite lane. I see lights emerge out of the gray. I open my door and run. I leave her in the car to die every time. Kind of gave away the story, but.
Well, a great story to give away, actually.
It's very much like it, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's all about like almost, and sort of you know, I think.
No, I love that. I love that line about almost. What about the almost?
But this being forced again, and yours, like to or not forced, because well, that's not the right word, but involuntarily revisiting these moments again and again and again and again, and that to me, you know, is the bread and butter of, you know, of the work, you know, and it's what everybody does. I think we just happen to write it up.
Right, right. In order maybe to, I was listening recently to an interview with Nora Ephraim,
Mm.
who I like because she's like so sort of no nonsense about things. Like, oh, why do people care? You know, which I'm in such a muddle that I sort of am drawn to people who seem so quick to like dismiss something or take it up or something. And she was saying how when she wrote her novel, based very much on her life, called Heartburn, about her husband at the time, like leaving her when she was, 7 months pregnant with their child and having an affair with another woman. And after she had written it, people said, and she was devastated. And they said, well, you must have, in the writing, you must have been very cathartic. That's always the word. And she's like,
bullshit.
no. She's like, the catharsis happened so that I was able to write about it.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
You write about the catharsis having happened, because otherwise you're just in the emotion.
Right.
Right.
And that doesn't make for very interesting prose normally. I suppose there are exceptions.
Not really. Well, it's our Chekhov, the hero of, for me, the hero of it all. Yeah. He said, sit down to write when you're cold as ice.
Mm.
So you're not going to be indulging yourself in all the.
Even then, he couldn't help himself. He was still, he endowed his characters with such humanity, even though he was cold with them, because he's rough.
Well, not cold emotionally, like not being empathetic. I think he meant don't be indulging in your like sort of, coddling yourself as a writer, really.
Not in the heat.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, Peter, I'm just finishing the wonderful novella Walt Kaplan is Broke, and that is made up of such a great voice and such wonderful fragments of memory and revisiting, and it's just a beautiful mosaic, an emotional mosaic to me. Would you read anything from that? Would that be okay? We have a couple of reading requests here.
They're totally random, and I've never read this before, but I'll just read it. This story takes place in Fall River, Massachusetts. The novella takes place in Fall River, Massachusetts, where my mother grew up and where my grandparents lived, and my very extended, pretty large Jewish family kind of colonized in Fall River. They're all gone now. They moved away. Sadly, Fall River has fallen on way hard times these days, as it's been falling on hard times since 1900. And there's always a time it's going to be revitalized. So this is I'll read a tiny excerpt. This is chapter 9. It involves the character Walt Kaplan. He's a furniture store salesman who has just had a heart attack. So this has kind of forced a reckoning of his memories. And the novella is sort of a collection of those reckonings. And this is in 1972, Fall River elected an undertaker mayor. Walt voted for him. Why not? He figured a guy who knew his way around embalming fluid was the guy their beloved city needed. Enough already, declaring Fall River dead, only to resurrect it a few years later in order to declare it dead again. Let it be dead and stay dead. Now dress it up and make it look pretty. Mayor Driscoll turned out to be just another pile in a dark suit, empty promises growing like the hair out of his ear holes. 4 years later, this past January 1976, Driscoll presided over the opening of the new city hall as the cars and trucks zoomed by underneath, past Fall River, as Walt Kaplan hadn't needed to be a clairvoyant to predict 15 years earlier. You build a highway through a city, people aren't going to pull over and shop in your stores. The only city hall in America constructed over an interstate. To build it, they had to obtain special air rights from the federal government. Out of some cramped sense of nostalgia, the city fathers had insisted that this new city hall rise, more or less, where the old one had stood unmolested for 117 years. I don't know if you've ever driven by Fall River. Maybe people have on their way to the Cape, which is why they built the highway through the damn city. But the highway, the Fall River City Hall literally is above the above the expressway, and people zoom by underneath. And it gets personal for me. This novella. My grandfather did have a furniture store where the highway is now, and they took it away. So anyway, that's just to give you a little taste of that story.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, we have a few questions here that are burning. Here's one. Joyce famously used the epiphany as the end point of many stories. Do you think that epiphany is an integral part of modern short stories or your stories?
I would say that the epiphany like hung over my stories when I was starting writing. It seemed like a sort of good organizing principle when I was first writing, and I loved the sort of conclusiveness of it. Like there's something, it's like a light suddenly comes from a different direction, or so that you feel you want every bit of a short story needs to be said, and then when you get to the last line, that's all that needs to be said, right? So if you think, oh, because that's when the epiphany happens at the end, or that's one way to think of it. But I think the more that I write stories, the more that it's just, I'm trying to just keep track of just everything that needs to be said about this particular, whatever it is, this image that's in my mind, this encounter that's happening. It's usually a quite small thing that has, a more than meets the eye to its kind of importance or value, and even what I sort of end up going for now more is a surprise at the end, like you think it's all this way, but until you get to the end, you're not really going to know where you end up. So that's not quite an epiphany. I was just reading an interview with George Saunders, and he was saying how, someone was asking him why in a story the character, does he need, in this particular story, need to be redeemed, redemption at the end of a story. And he was saying that he'd become a little suspicious of the redemption at the end of the story, as if, every story needs to say, we're just human, but gee shucks, we end up being really good guys or something at the end. So you're sort of like, not everyone does make the right choice at the end. And some people, given the chance to redeem themselves, they don't, and a story is just, here's one version of some particular human interaction or human experience, I guess, is as much. And that can have, that can have a moment of illumination or not, I think.
I totally agree. And I just real quick, I'd add that Joyce himself undercut this entire notion by everything he wrote after Dubliners. So because the idea that a piece of writing, any piece of writing, was leading towards one particular thing, that an epiphany sort of, I think he did a disservice, or the people that have followed that teaching have done us all a disservice, because as Susan's saying, that there are other things that happen in a story that can have that sense of torque. I mean, or that thwack that you said earlier, which I would say it would be a wonderful thing to replace epiphany with thwack. Because it's so clinical sounding. Like, oh, here comes the epiphany, like,
if not religious.
Yeah, right. And even in the Dubliners, I mean, and certainly in the Dead, that is not how it happens. There's not one place that is pinpointable. And I think that's what Joyce ends up teaching us later. There's no one pinpointable thing. And I would apply what he does in Ulysses to what he does to what I do in stories, or at least try to, which is it's a mess. And there's something in there that might be rising up.
Well, and it's also to have it be, I mean, I can see how that's a way to talk about a story if you're trying to sort of discuss it instead of just saying I like it or I don't. But it does sort of bypass the importance of, you know, all the rest of the story up to the epiphany, which in theory, you know, every sentence, every paragraph should be just as compelling as that, you know.
And you got
there's an interesting version of that in Cheever's The Sorrows of Gin, which is this beautiful, heartbreaking story told from the point of view of an 11-year-old girl who, you know, is sort of watching her alcoholic parents and sort of valiantly just describing her life and watching them fire the cook that looks after them and just being completely ignored. And the last paragraph of the story, we go out of her point of view into the father's point of view, who doesn't quite even have an epiphany. He's got like about 3 seconds of feeling sympathetic toward her in some general inchoate way, and then he loses it. And you just think, this poor girl, you know.
no pinpointable epiphany with a you underline in high school in that story, which, you know, and yeah.
Except for this father who we haven't even been in his mind the whole time. We just go in, but it lets us see what she has to look forward to in her father after, right? That's what it tells us.
Right, which is complicated.
Killer.
Yeah, good.
Is your good thwack.
Yeah. We have another question. Your thoughts about fictionalizing essays to transform into short stories?
I mean, one doing it oneself?
I guess so, yes. That's all that was all your thoughts about fictionalizing essays to transform into short stories.
You mentioned Borges earlier, and I suppose he might be a good person to think about in terms of how he seems to do that. You know, he seems to be telling you something, but, you know, I think that it seems to me just one of the many techniques that we have to trick you into reading our work. And if you think, oh, well, this kind of seems like an essay. This person seems like they're telling me about something. Great, because I'll do whatever it takes to get you in there. You know, I mean, the guy who was an undertaker, mayor of Fall River, that's real. I couldn't not use that. It was the most wonderful thing when I found out that there was actually a funeral director who was mayor, I thought, this is too good to be true. I got to use it. So, but then a fiction is not an essay. A story is not an essay. So, but I think Borges tricked his readers into thinking that too. I know a lot of academics who read Borges as if he's not yanking your chain, you know. So
I think that maybe for the person asking the question, they're thinking of like an essay that he or she or they may have written and like trying to make that into a story. And I think it's possible to find material in things you've written and lift some part of it and think, oh, there's a story there. But one cannot like slap, you know, upon the other, like a story made into a film. You know, it doesn't quite, even that is a change. There's also, Lydia Davis is a great practitioner of the story masquerading as an essay, masquerading as a story, or a story. It's like she's writing short stories, but they look like they're essays, but they're hilariously.
It's a beautiful way of sort of manipulate, because, you know, and I think fiction is often about manipulation in a good way. I mean, I don't think I don't hear that as a negative term in terms of fiction, and so it seems to be another way that we have to work with.
No, we want to be taken by we want the writer to, like, you know, take us.
Right.
I worried actually with this collection that people would think it was essays, but I just couldn't resist the title because it obviously it's a story that's written that's called
Story.
What?
It's a
Right.
story that time, but it's whatever it takes to pull people in. Like, oh, it's such a great take on why I write. There's always Orwell's got one. I think Chekhov even has a why I write. I think somewhere, but it's hilarious and also just draw. Like how many people think of this why I don't write, and then you have, but then it becomes a story. So it's a good example, I think, of something that might be taken on its face to be one thing, and then as a piece of fiction it grows. It starts to echo the separate in Susan's story, that the separate lines start to echo off each other, and you realize we're sort of in a contained, we're not just, this isn't random. So beautiful, and a good example, I think, for the question.
Yeah, great.
Mm-hmm.
So both of you have mentioned some wonderful writers. What writers do you love? What writers have influenced you?
That just keeps changing, I have to say. I mean, Chekhov from way back, Cheever at one point, really, Raymond Carver when I first read him, Amy Hempel when I first read her. I'm just thinking of the short story writers, Flannery O'Connor, certainly, Catherine Mansfield. Those were all just, I sort of stood in awe reading them when I was first starting to write. And now I certainly always think of like Beckett in the back of my mind, or I think of Borges in the back of my mind. And even George Saunders like fits in there because they write just not the way I really write, but I feel like I want a little of what they have going on there, whether it's something sort of playful, something that gets is very seem to be removed from a sort of usual kind of story, something that has these leaps of imagination in it, so I definitely keep them in mind too.
Great. Peter.
Oh, someone's calling.
Sorry, I'm trying to
Yeah.
quiet my family. Like a lot of the writers that Susan mentioned, and my teacher and mentor and close friend was Andre Debusse, who I learned a great deal from, and dearly love his work and return to it all the time. And another writer who I think doesn't get enough attention, so I always mention when I get this question, but is the writer Gina Berrialt, who was out of the Bay Area, and is just an extraordinary story writer, and one who I would put up in the pantheon of some of the people like Cheever and O'Connor and Debusse and others. I would also mention Welty as being a huge influence on me and what I try and do. Welty said, the hardest thing is to walk in someone else's shoes, and to be someone else. That's what fiction writers do. And so I try and.
What's your favorite Welty story?
Probably No Place for Me. No Place. What's the title? No Place for You, My Love. No Place for You, My Love. About two characters in a car, leaving a little luncheon in New Orleans and heading out into the.
I haven't read her in a long time, so I'm going to read.
No Place. Susan, I even thought of that story when I was reading your book this week.
Oh, okay. I don't know that story. Okay.
It's extraordinary, and they don't know each other. He's married. I think she might be married too, and they're heading out into the dark, and they end up at this bar, and they end up dancing, and they don't know each other, but they don't really need to. And people think of Welty as almost this old lady on the porch.
Yes, no, I love it.
And she was a brutal, deadly, tougher writer than I would say than some of her Southern compatriots. Even I think she can be deadlier than O'Connor even in her way.
That's hard. But I don't know, so I'll look. Yeah.
Right. There's no reason to compare the two, but
Yeah.
And Welty and O'Connor had a lot of affection for each other.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they're both great.
Great. Well, Grace Paley once said that she didn't have a story until she had two stories. What do you think of that?
That's a good, that's a good prompt.
Yeah.
Like many of these things, think of a moment and then make a story around it. Think of a time when you were terrified.
Right.
Think of a time, Amy Hempel famously wrote her story in the cemetery where Al Jolson is buried. The prompt on that was write about something you can't live down.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like a moment of sort of shame. That's a good prompt too. So having two stories that's a good thing. You're braiding two things. Like it might seem to be about this, but it's actually about that. That's sort of a good structural suggestion. Mm-hmm. Love that.
Good. So Peter, you agree?
It sounds like something Paley may have said. Something like this, like you have to have two stories. I mean, it sounds great. I'm lucky if I have half a story sometimes, or a third of it. But I'll take two. Yeah, that sounds great. Haley again is one of these writers who you kind of think is one thing, and then you read her and you realize,
yeah, no.
not. Is almost like certain writer. Paley almost has this sort of gentle affect. You look at her pictures, her holding her signs up at the, at protests and things like that. But then you get into her fiction and it's so much more complicated than the image that we have of her, I think. And so rereading Paley is just, can be really extraordinary. And she's been a major, major influence on me.
Well, that's another thing about stories actually is they, they're, to reread things to me is probably a deeper experience than just reading it the first time. I mean, it can be fine and lovely, but it's just not close to the second reading. And then the third reading, then you really get it. And you can do that more with stories. And, I'm lucky to sort of be forced to do that when I teach, because so I just read these stories over and over again. And the amazing thing is that they just get, deeper and deeper each time. It's so thrilling.
And they keep doing that. They keep leaving you suspended. We know what happens at the Al Jolson story, it's only 3 pages, so you can read it and read it and read it. And every time it won't not have an effect on you. And I think that really does, again, we don't need to talk up stories, because the people who love them don't need it. And those who don't have to find it on their own. But that rereadability, that rereadingness really is important.
Yeah. And that's what, I think you often hear people say, oh, I read that, I think, I liked it. Or, it's like, you don't, we don't treat stories the way we do songs. We'll just listen to them, or even movies. We'll watch them again and again, but they should be treated that way, And it's less of a commitment than rereading Anna Karenina again, which works just as well, I promise, but it just, more of a commitment.
We have one last quick question. What are each of you working on now?
You want to go? You hiding? Was that a hiding?
Question.
I should have been, this book was supposed to be a novella that I have been working on for almost 4 or 5 years now, maybe 6. And I was sort of writing some stories just on the side of working, because it started to turn into, it's not short enough to be called a novella anymore. So I was writing little things on the side, and then I realized I maybe had enough, because I reached back to old stories that if they never like got into a book, they were just gonna, curl up in my basement that I just had flooded yesterday, 2 days ago. So
That could go in why I don't write. That could be in that.
how yeah. And the second story in the book, which is called Occupied, it's about a single mom named Ivy who's having this sort of difficult affair with someone. That's actually an outtake from the novel. So that's what I'm working on. That was I decided to just make a story out of one part of the novel. So I get a piece out and
Great. Peter.
I always have a hard time with this question because it's a future thing that has no right. So
it's like pitching the movie that hasn't been
totally.
made. Never understand.
I'm always working, and I never have any idea if that work is gonna amount to anything that somebody might actually read someday. But I hope so.
Thank you both so much. This was brilliant. The books, folks, are Why I Don't Write by Susan Minot and Maggie Brown and Others. I guess it doesn't quite show in my thing here, by Peter Orner. You can find them at bookshop.org, and also go to the Brattleboro Literary Festival to see what .org, sorry, to see what else is cooking at the festival and to donate toward this wonderful festival. Thank you both so much. It was such fun. This will be put up on YouTube in a week or so, and also broadcast through Brattleboro Community Television. So thanks very, very much. Have a wonderful weekend. You were stellar, both. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I hope someday we all convene in actual real person.
Yeah. Brattleboro, right?
Brattleboro.
No,
Yeah, some great bookstores.
We're all hoping to be there with the leaves changing when we got asked. So
good. All right.
Thanks for having us. It's
all
great
right.
to talk to you, Peter.
Yes.
Bye.
Good to see you, Susan.
So good to see you.
See you later. Bye.